Okay, muted. All right, Dave, I think we're all here now, so we can pick up where Ian left off just before lunch.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll pass to Dr. Stewart. If we just have his presentation. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. And if anybody's just joining us after lunch, we've just concluded the summary of data sources for the stock assessment, and I'm now be moving into the modeling results and the reference points for this year. Okay, to reorient you to the stock assessment process, as was mentioned earlier this morning, we're on approximately a 3-year schedule for full stock assessments. The most recent full assessments have been in 2015, 19, and 2022. In 2023, we had an update stock assessment, and this year is again an update, which means we've made no major changes to the way the data are treated or the model structure that we're using. For 2025, we do have planned a full stock assessment, which means we'll be revisiting all aspects of the data and modeling approaches. However, even though it was an update, we did a number of analyses this year in support of the stock assessment. At the request of our scientific review board, we first conducted some simulation testing of our method for doing the stock assessment. And to summarize that information, the simulation testing basically posed the question, if we repeated the data sets that we have and refit models to them, could we recreate the dynamics? Essentially, are the data sets sufficient to populate the models that we're currently using? And the answer that we found was yes. Generally, we are able to do that. The stock assessment approach that we're using seems applicable to the data sets that we have. We then extended this simulation testing approach to specifically ask a different question, which was to evaluate different fishery independent setline survey designs. And again, to summarize several months of work into just a few bullets on this slide, we recognize that reduced FIS designs could lead to biased trend information. And what we wanted to find out was how and how much would this potential bias propagate into the stock assessment. What we found was that it will propagate into the stock assessment. We did, in particular, we did a simulation test looking at if the FIS index was decreasing at a rate of 15% over a 3-year time period, and we failed to detect that decrease. So the time series was flat, but it was in fact decreasing. How would this affect the stock assessment? What we found was that we would overestimate the biomass by approximately 3%. We would underestimate the fishing intensity. If the true value were 44%, we would estimate it to be an SPR of 45% or a lower level of fishing intensity. And that we would underestimate the risk of stock decline. If the true value for stock decline was 65%, we might only estimate a probability of 56%. Now, those values don't seem all that large, relatively small changes to the assessment results. However, what we found when looking back at recent harvest decision tables, what we found was that in order to account for this level of bias in the management decisions would have required a reduction in the coast-wide TCEY of between 1.5 and 4 million pounds to either reduce the SPR by 1% or to reduce the risk of stock decline by the 9% that we estimated. So what this suggests is that if we end up with a biased result from the fishery independent setline survey, that despite the fact that our fishery data would be unbiased, this might still propagate into the results of the stock assessment, and that it could have some important implications for management decisions. So now to summarize the stock assessment results. Because this is an update, we haven't made any changes. We're using the same 4 models that we've used in recent stock assessments. That's 2 long time series models and 2 shorter models. The shorter models include only the more recent period from the early 1990s, where we have complete data sets. The long ones reconstruct historical dynamics back into the late 1800s. They also differ. We have two of those, both the long and the short time series models, are aggregated up to the coastwide level. And the other 2 retain each of the data sets by individual biological regions. So we capture some of the spatial patterns in the data. And so we don't know which of these might be the best model over the long term to use to evaluate this stock. Each one, in fact, represents a different hypothesis about how the dynamics work and how we can best represent the observations that we have in hand. The results of each of these 4 models are equally weighted and integrated into a single distribution, So just as we would have uncertainty from a single model, we just have uncertainty from these 4 different models. And we characterize that all in the results and in this harvest decision table. And this on the right, you can see a graph of the probability distributions for each of the 4 models and their estimates of the 2025 spawning biomass, showing that we have a considerable amount of uncertainty among the 4 models as well as within each of these 4 models. So this is the result, the estimated spawning biomass time series from each of the 4 stock assessment models. You can see that although the scale differs considerably, especially as you go farther back in time, each of these 4 models estimates that we were at or near a biomass peak sometime in the late 1990s, that the stock declined fairly steeply through around 2010 or 11, and then increased gradually until about 2016 or 2017. That increase in the 2010s was due to the maturation of the 2005 year class. We saw that basically the last big year class we've seen was moving through the spawning biomass. And since that 2005 spawning biomass reached essentially full maturity in the around 2016 or 2017, we've seen a slow decline in the spawning biomass through until 2025. And you see, although this trend is flattening a little bit at the end of this time series, we've been continuing down now for almost a decade. Now, this graphic shows you a retrospective comparison across recent stock assessments. So each of the red points is the terminal year result of each of the most recent stock assessments, going all the way back to the 2012 stock assessment. The blue banding is the results of this year's stock assessment, the uncertainty interval associated with that, and the dark blue line is the point estimate from this year's stock assessment. And you can see right away that this year's stock assessment is considerably below last year's stock assessment. In fact, it's 17% lower in the 2024 spawning biomass estimate than we had at this time last year from last year's stock assessment. However, despite the fact that the scale is lower, you see that the trend in recent years is still estimated to be relatively flat. It's just that we estimate the stock to have dropped to a slightly lower level before you get to this period at the end of the last couple of years of the stock assessment model. Now, I presented pretty extensively in the summary of data one of the potential causes for this, or the potential cause for this, which is the fishery data that we have for 2024. So as we added each of the data sets to the stock assessment model, it became very apparent that the fishery data was the single source that was informing most of this decrease from last year's stock assessment result. So what we did was we then put all the data sources in, including the fishery independent survey, the age composition data, the updated mortality estimates for 2023 and 2024, and then just took out the fishery data on its own. And you see this gold line here represents the spawning biomass trend that we would get with all of the updated information except the commercial fishery data. And you see that's very consistent with the results we had last year. It's in fact going through that red point at the end of the time series. So what this tells us is that the fishery data alone is giving us a signal that the stock must be a little bit lower than we thought last year. And despite the fact that the fishery independent setline survey is not showing that trend, the fishery data, when we add it to the model, in the end, pulls that estimate downward. Now, there's several reasons why this might be the case, and I'll go through several of these. As I mentioned during the data part of this presentation, when we get a New Year's data, not only do we get the new year, so in this case, the 2024 observation of fishery CPUE, but the 2023 observation went down an additional 5% when we processed the data this year. So this is was a very important data point last year. In fact, we saw a similar pattern last year where the fishery data on its own was pulling the stock assessment result down, in particular that 2023 data point. And now when we fit this year's assessment, that data point, which was important last year, goes down again and again pulls the stock assessment down. Now, this is related, as I mentioned, in part to the fact that the fisheries are extending longer and longer after the close of the stock assessment data sets. Up until about 2020, we never had more than a week or two of fishing after we closed the stock assessment data sets. However, we did still see a similar pattern of reduced CPUE after the season was over. In addition to the change in the 2023 data, it's clearly there's something else going on this year as well. And that the fishery data is providing some information that's either not in the FIS data or is lagged to some degree. If I go back one slide, you'll see that even with this year's fishery independent setline survey data, it actually does line up with last year's stock assessment, suggesting that this year's FIS is more consistent with the result that we had in last year's fishery data than we're getting from this year's fishery data. So maybe we're getting a little bit of a different signal, or perhaps there's a bit of a lag in that the fishery is picking up something that the fishery independent setline survey hasn't yet. Now, I want to highlight a very important aspect of this is that this is not a model issue. This is not something that's going on inside the model, but in fact, it's a data issue. So we're actually revising the data from last year and to include all the most recent information. And that seems to be what's having the largest effect on the stock assessment. And the reason why that's particularly important is that this kind of uncertainty in data updates is something that's not quantified in the stock assessment. So I've drawn that dashed line out to the 2024 point, showing you what the fishery CPUE at the coastwide level might look like next year, but we don't know. And so because we don't know what it looks like yet, this is not actually included in this year's stock assessment results. I will, however, when I come back after the next presentation this afternoon, I do have one alternative projection that we ran to see what the effect of using a lower CPUE right now might be on our assessments, our assessment projections for next year. So moving now into the results of the stock assessment, this shows you the time series of relative recruitment. So each of the recruitment estimates from each of the 4 different models, and they're all standardized to their mean so that they're on at the same scale. We can compare which are the relatively the stronger and weaker year classes in recent years. And you can see right away that the 2005 year class is the strongest year class we've had since sometime in the early 1990s. However, you also see that the year classes leading up to 2005 were on average quite a bit higher than anything we've seen since 2005. And if we then look forward, we can see the 2012 year class, which, as I noted in the data presentation, that has been and is now the most important year class, both in the commercial fishery and now just barely supplanted by the 2016 year class in the fishery independent setline survey. That 2016 year class, while we are estimating it to be stronger than, say, 2013 through 15, and definitely stronger than 2006 through 2011, it's still not back on the magnitude of those year classes that we saw around 2005. And in fact, 2012 and 16 together are maybe at best around the average level we were getting before that. And so that's why we've seen this prolonged decline in the spawning biomass, despite evidence in the age data that we do have these 2 relatively prominent year classes. They're there and they're important. They're just not as big as the year classes we were getting previously. I'll also highlight that even including the 2016 year class, we have relatively weak information about the year classes from 2016 onward. And this is because we're just starting to see them in the various data sets. Although we did see the 2016 year class quite strongly in the fishery independent setline survey and in the fishery this year, it's really the first good read we've gotten on it. And as I mentioned there, we generally don't see a lot of 8-year-olds. So it's a little bit atypical to see this many fish at age 8 in both of those time series. If we look a little bit farther back into the historical record now, this is just using the results of 2 of the 4 stock assessment models, and they're not standardized, so that this absolute scale of these recruitments varies a little bit. But you can see that we had, after a period in the 1950s and 60s of low productivity, we had a period of high productivity that lasted from the 1970s all the way until the early 2000s. And the average recruitment over that time period was at or even right around the level that we've seen for 2012, maybe even slightly higher than 2016, as that's still quite uncertain. So you can see that what we're calling a decent or an important year class now would have only been average, wouldn't have stood out at all over the last several decades before that regime change in the early 2000s. And you really have to go all the way back into the 1950s or 60s to get to a prolonged period of recruitment where we saw years in a row of recruitment that were this low. So what this means for the stock is that we are just in a much lower productivity regime now. If we look to the stock status, and I'll refresh your memory on how we evaluate the stock status, we do that by measuring the effect of fishing on the spawning biomass. So the upper line in this graphic shows you the estimated spawning biomass that would have occurred in the stock from the early 1990s to present if we hadn't been fishing at all. So if we rolled back the clock and said, we're we're not going to catch a single halibut out of the stock, and play that forward, noting that the dynamics would have been different. We would have had more spawning biomass and therefore in some years slightly more recruitment. You can see that despite any fishing at all during that time period, we would have peaked in biomass somewhere around 2000, and that the spawning biomass would have declined over this period of 24 years, even if we hadn't been fishing on the stock. And this is two reasons. Especially early in the time series, we were still seeing the strong effects of declining size at age. And then over this whole time period, we were seeing the effect of moving from those higher recruitments in the 1980s and 90s into the lower recruitment in the more recent years, in the early 2000s, and then even lower in the later 2000s. And that's what's created this kind of stair-step pattern of declining spawning biomass over the time series. The lower line on this figure shows you our actual estimates of spawning biomass. So this is what we think actually happened in the water, and this does reflect the effect of fishing. And if we compare these two things, we can evaluate how much did our fishing affect the stock at any given time in this time series. So going from the peak of the actual spawning biomass, which we observed to have occurred in 1997, we estimate that at that time we had reduced the stock by approximately 38% due to fishing. So we were fishing, but really not all that hard in the late 1990s, and that's because the stock was increasing. We had all those big recruitments coming through. And in fact, the management at the time was actually not making huge increases relative to what might have been possible as the stock was going up. We go forward a little bit more to 2011, we can see that we were reducing the spawning biomass by 72% due to fishing. This was what we estimate to be the hardest fishing we were doing on the stock over this part of the time series. So fishing was having a large effect on the stock as of around 2011. We then go to the end of the time series. In 2025, we estimate that the fishing has reduced the spawning biomass by 63% compared to what it would have been if we hadn't been fishing. And so you can see that since 2011, the reductions in quota that the commission has taken have actually reduced the effect of fishing on the stock. Despite the fact that the spawning biomass has gone down, we've actually moderated that trend by our reductions in the fishing mortality limits. So we're actually having a smaller effect on the stock now at a lower biomass than we were back in 2011 at a slightly larger biomass. Now the ratio of those two lines is what gives us the stock status. And so this graphic shows you the stock status is estimated in each of those years. And as I mentioned, we reduced the stock to the largest degree in 2011, where we now, looking backwards, estimate we may have been at or just below that 30% biomass threshold. As of beginning of 2025, we estimate that the current status is at 38% of the unfished biomass, with a very broad confidence interval. You see that blue interval there actually extends below our B30% threshold, and actually even slightly below our B20%, which is our conservation threshold. So there is some small amount of probability that we are even below our conservation threshold as of the beginning of 2025. We move then into our estimates of fishing intensity, the other axis of our reference points. Similar to the spawning biomass plot that I showed you before, each of the black lines ending in a red dot is our estimate from a previous stock assessment of the level of fishing intensity on the stock projected forward into the upcoming year. The blue banding is this year's stock assessment, with the dark blue line showing you the results of this year's estimate of fishing intensity. And for 2024, we estimate that the fishing intensity corresponded to an SPR of 47%. Noting that the reference levels shown as the green line there, previously 46%, and then beginning in 2021, an F43%, have been right around this level of fishing that we now estimate to have occurred on the stock since approximately 2013, with each of these previous stock assessments being bouncing around above or below that level, but all in this range around the reference level over this time period. So this table summarizes the stock assessment results. I've talked through most of these reference points, the fishing reference points, the spawning biomass reference points, and in the data presentation, I spoke about the trends in stock distribution. I would say the only component that I haven't spoken to on this plot is perhaps the fishery context, noting that the fishing mortality in 2024 estimated at 35.63 million pounds, is just a little bit lower than the 5-year average. And of that mortality, approximately 84% was actually landed in some form in some fishery sector. So conversely, about 16% of the poundage of Pacific halibut that died in 2024 was discarded and ended up just dead back in the water. So to summarize the stock assessment results for this year, fishing mortality did increase slightly despite the reduction in TCDY in 2024. We continue to see across all these various data sets showing us that the stock and the fishery and the survey are shifting from older to younger fish. We see that these fish, that both the fishery and the fishery independent setline survey indices are at historically low levels. The fishery CPUE for the second year in a row had the largest effect of any data set on the spawning biomass results from the stock assessment, decreasing that 2024 spawning biomass by 17% compared to last year's stock assessment. So overall, our estimate of the scale of the stock is lower. And the stock remains at a low productivity level because due to weighted age and this continued low recruitment, which we can now estimate through approximately 2016, that we continue to stay in this low phase of recruitment. The spawning biomass, however, is estimated to be above our B30% threshold, and the fishing intensity still below that F43% reference level. The recommendations from this presentation are to note the paper, which was posted Friday, document 11 Rev 1, which provides a summary of data and assessment results for the 2024 stock assessment. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. So we'll take questions from commissioners first, but I just remind others on the line that public comment and questions will follow. And that covers agenda. It would cover questions for agenda items 3 through 5.2, the current one we just looked at from you. So, Richard.
Yes, Dr. Stewart, I have a question on your earlier before lunch presentation. You know, when you talked about the bait differences this year between the pink and the chum, is that factored into the stock assessment this year?
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner Yamada. As Dr. Webster mentioned, he estimated, as part of our modeling of the survey data this year, he estimated the calibration coefficient between the two baits, and he estimated that separately for each of the IPHC regulatory areas. And so when he standardized to create the index that goes into the stock assessment, that index was standardized as if we had used chum salmon bait everywhere. So that is included. What's also included is the uncertainty associated with that calibration. So that also leads to a slightly greater degree of uncertainty in this year's survey, because not only did we have to estimate the stock trend in each of those areas, but we needed to estimate the bait effect as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? John.
Thanks, and thanks, Ian. So I asked about this during the preview that the commissioners got on the stock assessment on Friday, but I just wanted to bring it up again here in this forum. And this has to do with, I believe it was slide 29, has to do with the effect of the reduced scope of the FIS and the potential that there may be bias in the FIS results that might not be reflected in the risk tables that the commissioners will be using to make our decisions in January. And so I'm just interested in any thoughts, Ian, that you may have on how we should account for that.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I want to be clear that we don't know whether the FIS index that we have this year does have bias in it or not. This is a risk as the design becomes sparse. Bias can creep in there because we're not covering all of the geographic area of the stock. So this analysis was intended to tell us not whether the bias was there, but if it was there, how might it affect our stock assessment? And we likely won't know, perhaps until we get more data down in subsequent years, whether or not we may have had a bias in this year's result. So the way to interpret this is Well, first, several questions that we were trying to pose here. The first one was trying to understand if we had a biased FIS index, but we had unbiased fishery data, you might expect that under some FIS designs that the fishery data might sort of counterbalance and lead to not too much bias in the stock assessment results. And what we found was that it's true to some degree. It didn't translate directly into a 15% bias in this particular scenario, but in fact was a somewhat smaller bias, and probably that was helped by the fact that the fishery data were also there in the simulation analysis. But the way to interpret this would be that if in fact we had a bias that we didn't know about, we would be overestimating the biomass somewhat, and we would be underestimating the fishing mortality. And so if we wanted to think about the context for this year's decision making, knowing that there is a risk that there could be a bias, this is an unquantified risk that wouldn't be in the decision table. So when we look at the results from the decision table and see an SPR associated with a particular catch level or a probability of stock decline, know that if there is potentially a bias in the FIS, that could lead those to be underestimates of the fishing intensity and underestimates of the stock decline. And that would translate for a 15% bias in the FIS, that would translate to about a 9% bias in the risk of stock decline and perhaps a 1% bias in fishing intensity. So I think that would be the way to consider this information as a supplement to the standard harvest decision table that you'll have in front of you.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very helpful. And you always provide a helpful list of various factors that are not just not easily captured in the risk table. So I just want to highlight that both for commissioners and for the public to understand that there may be another level of risk there that we should be mindful of. Thanks.
Good question, John. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yep. Thanks, Ian, Dr. Stewart. The age 8 or 2016 year class, where would they kind of be in terms of a maturity curve? I assume not many mature at this time, so they're not feeding a lot into the spawning biomass.
Yes, you're correct. So our current estimate is that these fish start to mature at age 8. And so they would be making their first contribution to the spawning biomass this year, and then increasing rapidly after that. And that's actually a very important point, which is that even though that estimate of the 2016 year class is still quite uncertain, it's already included in the results here. And so when I get to the projection results, that will be counting on that 2016 year class to continue to mature on schedule. Now, with that said, you're going to hear from Dr. Planis that we are right in the middle of updating our estimates of maturity. And it's possible that the 2016 year class could actually be contributing a little bit more than we think. But we're still in the middle of that analysis. We're hoping to have a revised maturity schedule included in the 2025 full stock assessment.
Okay, thank you. One other question just around your projections for the stock. I understand in British Columbia, like you're saying, the projection is that 95% the commercial TAC will be achieved. I'm skeptical if that's going to happen in Canada, just looking at the DFO statistics coming in. So I'm just curious how that would affect, if that was a trend that's happening through a number of regions, how that would affect the stock assessment, say next year, because your projection is off a little bit, possibly.
Thanks for the question. And it almost certainly is. We're projecting forward, as Dr. Hutchinson mentioned, we're projecting forward from the end of October through the end of the fishing year. And so there are bound to be some differences. What I found in previous year stock assessments is that one of the first things I do is update all the various sources of mortality for the first year of the stock, or for the terminal year of the stock assessment. And generally a small difference in the mortality in that year really makes very little difference to the stock assessment results. The things that are important are the new fishery data and the new fishery independent survey information. So I would expect that even if we're off by even a few million pounds, at the end of the year. That's unlikely to have a big effect on either the projections from this year or the results next year when we reestimate.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question. Maybe you could just go over it a little more on why that data issue had such a profound effect on the spawning biomass. 17% decrease seems like a lot to me. So if maybe there's some compounding things, maybe just go into that a little bit, please. Thank you.
I can, thanks. And it is definitely one of the most important aspects of this year's stock assessment. So you'll recall from last year that the fishery data were very important last year as well. We had a similar pattern where we put all the data in, and then when we added the fishery data as the last data source to the stock assessment model, it brought the coast-wide estimate of spawning biomass down, and I believe it was by 11% last year. That fishery data was important then. And then this year, not only do we get another point corroborating that low level that we observed last year, but last year's value also went down. And so it's essentially like getting 2 new data points from the fishery information this year. Now, there's a few other things that I didn't mention the first time through. One is that the fishery data, the age data from the fishery, our information on males and females also lacks a year. It takes us a year to process that information. So now for 2023, not only do we have a lower observation, but we now have sex-specific ages. And so the model has to do a much better job of fitting that information than when we just had aggregate ages across the 2 sexes. So we're getting a second important signal there as well. Now, the third important piece is that in years past, because of this uncertainty in the fishery data, we've actually assigned a larger variance to the fishery data in the terminal year, knowing that it's likely to change. But in this case, where it's going downward, this is actually causing a larger effect in the following year. So imagine we had that data point from 2023 last year, but we had a bigger variance on it. This year, we have a lower data point and actually a smaller variance estimate. So the models are forced to fit that data even more closely in 2023. So we really have a compounding of a whole bunch of different factors that are leading that single data point to be especially influential. The last component I would mention, and this is perhaps the most important one, is that I think we're also starting to see the signal from the models relying more on the fishery data than on the fishery independent setline survey data, or relatively more than they have in the past. As we have greater uncertainty in our survey index, we're going to rely more heavily on the fishery data. I mean, at the extreme, if we didn't have any survey information at all, the fishery data would be the only thing telling us about the stock dynamics. And I think we're starting to see that shift a little bit this year with the greater uncertainty in the survey. So the challenge here is that I can't say for sure that we're necessarily going to see the same kind of updating or the same kind of pattern next year. And so I can't say that, well, for sure the assessment is biased in one way or the other, because it may or may not be. So this is a kind of a challenging point in time where we know there's uncertainty here, but it's very difficult to say necessarily which direction it might go in the future.
Okay, that helps. I'll probably have to have it a couple more times to really get a sink in, but that helps a lot. Thank you very much.
All right, any other commissioner questions?
Yeah, Paul, this is Bob.
Go ahead, Bob.
So a question to Dr. Stewart on this slide here. The 17% down, is that encapsulating any underestimations in the last 2 years?
Yes. So this year's assessment is using the red time series here. So it's using the data that have been updated in both of those years, both 22 and 2023. Okay. So we're using all the information we have right up to date.
And then the second question that I had in the previous, before lunch, there was a comment that the 2A fish were small, 15 pounds. And I know Dr. Plantis has done some studies in the past. Do we know where those fish come from? Like, do they come from Rose Spit, or do they come out of the Bering Sea?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Albertson. I think it's possible that those fish could have come from nearly anywhere in the stock. We have some tagging data, some historical tagging data where we actually do have recoveries. We have tags that were released in the Bering Sea as juveniles and recovered as far south as the West Coast. So we know they can make that migration. But in terms of any particular fish, I don't think we really know. It could have come from anywhere in the stock range.
Thank you.
Okay, not seeing any other questions from commissioners. Regarding public comment, don't see any here, Dave, but it might not be seeing the full picture.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. We do have a couple of questions from the public, one in writing and then one verbal. So if we could just bring that PowerPoint presentation up, we can quickly step through them. Perfect, nice and quick. So the first question is from Linda Bankin. And it's a written comment regarding agenda item 5.2 on the space-time modeling of survey data. And it's asking Dr. Webster to please provide comment on opportunity or challenges to shortening the survey set soak times to reduce loss to sand fleas. And so, Dr. Webster, I pass to you to respond.
Thank you for the question, and I might defer to Tyler for greater expertise because he has provided me with an answer to this question, which I'll try to summarize. So there was a loss of about 4,000 of fish sale revenue due to fish damaged by sand fleas and other related issues. But if we lower this to soak time, according to Tyler's response, we would end up setting fewer sets per day, which would result in more days on the water. So that would increase our staff costs as well. So it's not a clear win by lowering soak time and reducing the losses potential losses due to sand fleas. And if Tyler would like to add to that, I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, I think Ray sums it up pretty succinctly. I think after you consider, I think the consequence of long or of shorter soak times would mean that you'd have to probably have fewer sets in a day. So as he had said, it would probably mean only 2 sets in most cases, and that would add significant time on the water, field staff costs, and I think only after a few days, the amount of money that we would gain from getting better quality fish would probably be lost in revenue. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. The next is a request to make an oral intervention, Chair, and that's from Buck Lakaitis on agenda item 5.2 stock assessment. And so if you're okay, Chair, we'll give Buck the microphone and go ahead and have his intervention.
Yeah, that's fine.
Go ahead, Buck. I can see he has a microphone active, but Buck, are you there? Not seeing a response at the moment, Chair. I'd suggest that we potentially come back to Buck's question, and or alternatively, he can send in a written comment. But Buck, if you can hear us and you can't connect, if you could just work with the team and we'll get you a microphone. Looks like a lot of work now. Buck, can you hear us?
Okay.
Perfect.
That's success. Yeah, Buck Lakaitis. Sorry about that. This is, if you'd allow me, Mr. Chairman, just to provide a little bit of a report from the ground, so to speak. We have a boat fishing in the Bering Sea right now, and the news is not good. It's basically our Bering Sea fishing, and I'd say my company in the last 10 years has caught as much halibut as any company, 3 boats fishing in the Bering Sea. We think we're experts fishing there. Lived my whole life there. I and 2 other captains participate. And you'll notice from the IFQ allocation and landings tables that only 30% of all the CDQ has been caught this year. We haven't even caught 20% of what we set out to do in 4 months. August, September, October, November will probably be the last boat to deliver in the Bering Sea next week. And we've said this for 5 years in a row, worst fishing we've ever seen. And we're saying that again this year by a long shot. So just to give you some idea, last year, 38% of the CDQ was caught in the Bering Sea. This year, 30%. The year before, 2022, was 56%. And the year that Ian just mentioned, 2011, where we slipped below a conservation line, we caught 86 to 89% of our 4C and 4D quota that year. We're seeing much worse stock status on the grounds than 2011, much worse, and the trend is accelerating downward. So I don't think that incremental cuts to quota are going to cut it. So I'm going to be calling for a rebuilding plan in the Bering Sea. Of course, it's one stock. I'm mostly centering my comments on the Bering Sea because that's where we have most of our effort. But frankly, 3B fishing was not very good. But I'm very concerned about the Bering Sea. How you address my proposal that you'll see in January, and hopefully I'll be there to address all of you. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I will be informing the council next week as well. And I don't know who to place the blame on. All I know is we've been incrementally reducing our biomass in the Bering Sea. I'm not sure what it's all about. That's kind of your job, but mine is to inform you that this is much worse than your stock assessment is showing. And that's all I have. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you in January.
Buck, thank you very much for sharing that information with us, and we'll be looking for your report so it can be discussed at the annual meeting. And,
thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
John, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything.
Appreciate the opportunity, Paul. Buck, if you're still there, I don't know if you've given any thought to what you believe a rebuilding plan ought to look like, but I thought I'd just give you an opportunity to address that if you have.
Well, thank you for that question. Of course, everything's related to that overall allocation. So all sectors could be affected. I think all sectors are probably causing a decline. But just for starts, if my boats can't go out and we're given an allocation, whether it's an IFQ or a CDQ, or we're leasing a fishing group's CDQ. If we can't in a timely manner go out and harvest some percentage, I mean, we're like 25% of what we set out to do. Then we have all the economic considerations. We could cut the quota 50%. And it wouldn't even really change anybody's economics other than their expectation, because we're consistently harvesting less than 50% in all area 4, IFQ and CDQ. I mean, it's declining every year. We were above 50%. So and then it kind of comes to, okay, we're one stock. So if the Bering Sea is affected, and I'm saying as a fisherman, I'm willing to take a 50% cut. If that's really what it takes, I mean, maybe it's close the fishery. Maybe it's a 50% cut. Last year, I proposed for all areas, everywhere that we manage, a 25% cut, and just take 5 years, leave it down for 25%. We don't need more surveys. The fish just aren't there. And that people thought I was kidding, but I just don't think incremental changes, 3%, 5%. I don't think we have enough of an understanding of what's going on. It might be the length of seasons, and maybe fish aren't getting together to spawn. It might be a combination of length of season and constant pressure on the grounds by all sectors. There's so many things that I think a comprehensive rebuilding look, a new look at the way this fishery is being managed is what's needed. It's not tweaking the stock assessment, in my mind. So long-winded answer to your question, because I'm just starting to think about this. It would take a more comprehensive look, and hopefully while we're looking, there's some large changes to the removals is my suggestion. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it very much.
Are there any other comments, Dave?
Yes, Chair, there's one more, another written comment from Linda Bankin that's just come in for agenda item 5.2 on stock assessment, and it's a question for Dr. Stewart. And the question I'll just read aloud and then pass to him to respond. It says that Dr. Stewart mentioned that the fishery is extending later in the season since 2020, and that we generally see a drop in weight per unit effort later in the season. Is he suggesting that the extended season is resulting in potentially misleading fishery data, since WPUE is low during the extended season and having data from that time of year is new? I am trying to understand the context of that comment, so I'll pass to Dr. Stewart.
Yes, thanks for the question, Linda. I appreciate the chance to clarify a little bit more. So actually, when I made that comment, my intent was to highlight that with a longer season and more weeks of fishing after we close the stock assessment data sets, there are just more logs outstanding. We have fewer of the total fishing trips documented at the time of the stock assessment. So that's going to lead potentially to a greater offset or greater change in the data that following year when we add all those logs that we were missing. However, I think you raise a good point here, which is that there also is the potential that by changing the seasonal dynamics of the fishery, we're starting to see an effect of reduced CPUE that may not be strictly proportional to the stock. Unfortunately, what we would normally do when we had that concern would be to rely more heavily on the fishery independent setline survey data. And that's really why we rely on the survey, is because we know that it's going to be subject to fewer things like season length and bad weather at the end of the season and other things going on. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where there probably is some effect on the CPUE of the change in season, but we're not really able to discount that as we might, because we also have increased uncertainty in the survey itself. So I think both of those are things to think about in the context of this, the longer seasons we've seen since 2020.
Okay, and that's all the questions we have, Chair.
All right, thanks, Dave. If there are no other comments or questions at this point in time, I just remind those folks online that there's an opportunity, actually two more opportunities today. One once we finish item 7, and the second again after item 8. So if you do have comments, please get them in, or questions. That would be good. So for now, we'll carry on and hear from Dr. Hicks on the management strategy evaluation.
Great, thanks very much, Chair. And so for those listening, that is paper 12. And we're going to have the presentation for paper 12 up, please, and then make Dr. Hicks a presenter. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, commissioners. I'm going to provide a brief presentation on the IPHC management strategy evaluation and the harvest strategy policy today. I'm going to try to summarize quite a bit of work into the next 20 to 30 minutes. So bear with me. I want to start, as I always do, with a brief definition of management strategy evaluation. I know we get very focused on the stock assessment for good reason, and that's a really important result of this, but management strategy evaluation is slightly different from the stock assessment. It is a process to evaluate harvest strategies and develop a management procedure that's robust to uncertainty and meets defined objectives. So really one of the main differences of management strategy evaluation is a long-term look at the consequences of management, whereas the stock assessment is that more tactical short-term view of how things are going with the stock. So part of this process we'll discuss today are goals and objectives, various management procedures and elements of a management procedure, and then simulation and evaluation. I'll present results to you, and then the potential application. And this is the really exciting part. The harvest strategy policy is really now we're moving into that application part of the process, the MSE process. And I just want to highlight too that these arrows are showing this is an iterative process. So I don't want anyone to think that the application step or the adoption of a harvest strategy policy or a management procedure is the end of the line, and then we're all stuck with that for however long it is. No, we're still going to learn from what we observe, and there will be chances in the future to update that. So the benefits of management strategy evaluation, there are a lot of benefits and a lot of uses of this type of process. We can evaluate different elements of MPs, and today we're going to evaluate fishing intensity and assessment frequency. It can assist in the development of a harvest strategy policy, and that's certainly what the MSE is doing. And I see the harvest strategy policy as sort of a really good milestone of all the work that we've been doing for over 10 years now. You can use MSE to meet requirements of certification agencies. You can evaluate different monitoring strategies, and we'll actually present some results of the effects of different FIS designs that will hopefully be useful. And then you can examine various scenarios such as environmental effects or environment scenarios, such as if the PDO was always low or it was always a cold regime and recruitment was always at its lower average. You can examine what the consequences of those things are to get a better understanding of the effects of management on the stock. So before I get into some of those details, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the harvest strategy policy and what a harvest strategy policy is. And we can think of that as a framework for applying a consistent and transparent science-based approach to setting mortality limits while also ensuring sustainability. And there's a number of different things that harvest strategy policy is useful for. Just to highlight a couple, it identifies appropriate methods to manage the natural variability and the scientific uncertainty. It accounts for risks, balances trade-offs, and a lot of other benefits to having harvest strategy policy. I want to note, though, that this harvest strategy policy is not to replace anything that's within the that's defining the commission. So it's really going to be used alongside the protocol amending the convention and providing the basis to manage risks to Pacific halibut fisheries and the population. So it's another document that's really a guiding document on how the Pacific halibut population is managed. So the IPHC has been actually operating under an interim harvest strategy policy for at least 8 years now. And this has not been formally documented or endorsed by the commission. And as a reminder, that's an SPR-based approach. And there's this reference SPR 43% that was actually determined based on simulation work from the MSE framework, as well as advice from the Management Strategy Advisory Board. And so we'll get into some of the details on this exactly, but think about, we've been operating under this harvest strategy policy thus far. It just has not been documented, or I guess you might say it's been documented through different reports, but very difficult to an outsider viewing the process to understand what that harvest strategy policy is. Okay, so MSE had a number of activities in 2024, and all these activities are actually at the direction of the commission. And here ID stands for intersessional decision. There was some intersessional decisions by the commission. I think it was in June that these occurred, and the link is down there on the lower right. But these intersessional decisions were to consider updating fishery objectives, to evaluate management procedures, different elements, to look at some FIS design scenarios, to draft the harvest strategy policy document, and then consider exceptional circumstances, which I'll describe later. But in brief, exceptional circumstance is something that occurs that doesn't match with what we expected, and thus opens up the evaluation process again in the future. So I'll jump into the goals and objectives, and I have listed here the 4 priority objectives of the commission in the dark blue on the left, and they're lettered A, B, C, and D. And based on, I think it was the 99th annual meeting, these objectives were put forward as in priority order, actually. So you have to meet A, and then meet B, and then meet C, and then meet D. So they're basically maintaining the long-term female spawning biomass above 20%, at least 95% of the time. So making sure it doesn't really go below that level. The objective B is maintaining that female spawning biomass above B36% at least 50% or more of the time. So just maintaining it above that proxy for MEY. And then we have optimized average coastwide TCY, or the yield, and then limiting the changes in the coastwide TCY, those interannual changes. So based on recommendations from the SRB and the MSAB, the commission then directed the Secretariat to have a look at some of these objectives. So a little bit of background on this is at SRB 24, the SRB recommended that the commission develop a more specific and quantifiable catch objective to replace objective C, that is optimize average coastwide TCY. We'll talk about that. Another recommendation from the SRB is that the commission consider revising objective B, and that is the one to maintain the spawning biomass above B36%. And they had some suggestions of maybe utilizing a lower percentile than 50%. But really the gist of that recommendation is for the MSAB, the commission, and the Secretariat to consider alternatives to that if that is not meeting if that's not one of the better objectives that we have in the list. So intersessional decision 3 was that the commission explore a new coastwide objective related to B36%. And in response to that, we had an ad hoc meeting with the MSAB, discussions with the SRB, and then another meeting with the MSAB at MSAB 20. So let's first talk about objective C and this SRB request to redefine the word optimize, or to define an objective that is more quantifiable. And so the SRB noted that the optimize is vague and cannot be evaluated very easily in the evaluation of a performance metric, say. But in defense of that, the MSAB chose this word because they wanted some flexibility during the evaluation of the results. And it wasn't necessarily that the MSAB wanted to maximize yield, because they were also considering the trade-off with interannual variability in the yield. So given the discussion that we had at MSAB 20, the MSAB made a recommendation that the commission priority objective, optimize average coastwide yield, or TCY, be changed to maximize average coastwide yield, and that this objective, along with the variability in yield objective, be given equal consideration to allow for the evaluation of those trade-offs. And in other words, the MSAB, in my view of what the MSAB was writing here in the report, is that they find both of these concepts very important. The amount of yield, but also how much that yield, the TCY, changes from year to year. And when you look at the results, you will find that there is a clear trade-off between these two concepts. And we'll view that in a moment. So one potential way to reword this is to number these priority objectives. And then when we get to this maximize yield and minimize the annual variability in the yield, is to just number them the same as 3 and maybe call them A and B or something like that. And this was really something we worked through with the MSAB. At the end, I'll show all of the objectives in summary, but we're trying to figure out a way that we can fit this into the commission's priority objectives without making too many changes and maintaining what the commission desires as well. The second objective we considered was this at or above B36%. This was objective B. I want to give a little bit of background on this before we go into the objective too much. So I'm going to back up a year from now and look at the 2023 stock assessment results, not what Dr. Stewart presented today, but what Dr. Stewart presented about a year ago. And what we saw was relative spawning biomass was above 36%. It was estimated at 42% a year ago. And this is really measuring the effect of fishing. So we're above target. Actually, the stock status was increasing at that time. And in terms of that was the only view we had of the stock and the management, it would look like it was pretty good. However, the WPUE and the catch rates from the fishery were at the lowest that had been observed in the last 20 to 30 years. And this was concerning to managers and stakeholders alike, but this is also affected by weighted age and recruitment along with fishing. So there was some concern here. We're seeing good status, we're seeing low catch rates, and thus the commission decisions were to actually reduce the TCUI from the reference determined by an SPR 43%. And it actually set the TCUI in 2023 and 2024, those 2 years, near an SPR of around 50 or 52%. So in other words, the commission decided to depart from the reference fishing mortality, which is totally fine and is their purview. But the reason is, why are they doing that? And is that something that we should bring into the MSC process as an objective so that we can find the best way to manage the stock that does meet the objectives of the commission? So some important concepts that we thought about were catch rates and absolute biomass seem to be important, especially when they're low. Maybe less important when they're high, but certainly important now when the catch rates seem to be at a low level. The threshold objective, or this B36%, can easily be met even when the catch rates and absolute spawning biomass are low, which just indicates that there's more than fishing affecting the stock of Pacific halibut. Some other concepts are when fishing at SPR 43% in the long term, so consistently fishing at that level, the stock would fluctuate around a relative spawning biomass, about 38.8%. It would be below that half of the time and above that half of the time. And then fishing at an SPR 40% would put that stock right around the B36%, 50% or more of the time. So then working with the MSAB, what did we discuss at the MSAB about working towards a potential new objective? First, the MSAB noted that a new objective to maintain the coast-wide TCY above a threshold. So here, instead of using an absolute biomass as something to maintain the stock above, they said, what if we just said we want the coast-wide TCY to be above some value? We did not come up with what a good value would be, but see, you could choose a number like 20 million pounds, 30 million pounds, 40 million pounds, whatever it is that would be a good objective. They thought that this might be useful because, one, it's meaningful to stakeholders. Obviously, TCY has a lot of meaning to stakeholders. It may be possible to define a minimum TCY that would be necessary for economic viability of the fishery. I've seen this done with other fisheries. And it may be a proxy for maintaining catch rates and absolute spawning biomass above a threshold, which could also be important to stakeholders. So in other words, the MSAB talked about a potential new objective and felt we could have an objective that said maintain the spawning biomass above what the spawning biomass was estimated at in 2023, but it would actually potentially be more meaningful if we just talked about maintaining the TCY above some level that we want to be above. The MSAB also discussed the usefulness of the current objective, or this B36% objective. And they felt that that is a useful objective because it does separate the fishing effects from the environmental effects on the stock. It can scale with changes in productivity. In other words, it's a dynamic approach to managing the stock and determining stock status. It defines a desired relative spawning biomass to be at or above, and is a proxy for BMEY. And it is an objective that is often very important for certification agencies. So there's, in other words, to summarize this up, there's a lot of reasons that both of these types of objectives are useful. And the MSAB didn't come up with a clear conclusion on this, other than I think a good conclusion out of this is that the MSAB did feel that the current objective could be a useful objective for the commission to maintain. So to summarize the current objectives, one, the MSAB felt keeping the current priority objectives would be useful, but changing optimized yield to maximize yield and setting equal priority for maximizing yield and reducing interannual variability. And then we felt, it'd be useful to report an additional performance metric. There's still some uncertainty whether maintaining the spawning biomass above some threshold would be useful. So we felt, well, let's just show what that would look like as an example and see if that is a useful performance metric for people to consider. And so you'll see in the results, I'll report probability that the short-term spawning biomass is less than the spawning biomass estimated in 2023. So here on the right are potential commission objectives in priority order, noting that the last two there are numbered 3 and given A and B to indicate that they are subject to evaluation after 1 and 2 are met and are in equal priority order. So potentially this is a way to answer a question earlier on how can we incorporate this in the priority set of objectives succinctly. Okay, so that's the fun with the objectives. Now let's move into the evaluation of management procedures, which is the really fun part for me. And we've examined a number of management procedures this year. One are different levels of fishing intensity shown here. The assessment frequency being annual as we currently have, biennial or triennial. Noting that in the biennial and triennial options, when there is not a stock assessment, the change in the TCY would be proportional to the change in the FIS 032 WPE. I'll explain this a little bit more later. We examined some constraints. That means constraining the TCY and how much it can change from year to year. And we did a 15% up and down, meaning the TCY cannot change by more than 15% when going up or down. And we also examined the constraint. It cannot change by 15% or more when it's increasing, but can change by whatever it needs to when it's decreasing. And then we looked at some FIS designs. The distribution of the TCY is part of the decision-making process. That's been decided by the commission and noted by the SRB as well. And therefore, that's not a management procedure that we're actually evaluating. Instead, it's part of the uncertainty in the simulations of the MSE. So you will not see any results related to different ways to distribute the stock or the TCY among the regulatory areas. So what is this empirical rule in non-assessment years exactly? I thought I'd give a quick slide here to show an example of that. And this is the process where you would determine the reference coast-wide TCY when you do not have a stock assessment. And that is specifically the reference coast-wide TCY would change in proportion with the FIS 032 WPE. So when Dr. Webster and Dr. Stewart present the coast-wide FIS 032 WPE and says it declined by 9%, that means the reference TCY for next year would also be 9% lower than it was the previous year. And I always like to put an equation in my presentation. So there's the equation for everybody. But there are other options to do that. You could use all sizes WPUE. You can build a really simple model. We have some production models we could put in, or we could just fix it at the value that it was last year. There are other options, but this is all that we have tested at this time. But I wanted to show a quick example how this would work at the bottom here. And so you can see in the gray boxes are the TCY that would be set by an annual stock assessment. And then these blue boxes are the TCY that would be set in a triennial assessment frequency. So here you notice they're starting pretty much at the same place because this was an assessment year, 2028, and the projection of these in the future. And then they depart. So the assessment says, oh, it was going up, but the FIS said, nope, it's going down. And then the FIS said, oh, now it's going up, and the assessment says it's going up. And then in that third year, they conduct an assessment again. And they come closer together because it's just the assessment that's setting the TCY in that year. But they're not exactly the same because there was a little bit more harvesting in these higher points and a little bit less harvesting in those. So, but they're very similar. And then we do another 3-year period, setting it based on FIS, and then setting it on the assessment in the third year, and so forth going forward. So what I learned from putting this example together is that when the assessment comes, it's sort of correcting it back into the realm of what the assessment thinks, bringing all the data together as the appropriate TCY level. They depart a little bit from there, and then they sort of come back together. Okay, so this is how we typically present the MSE results in a table with the different performance metrics associated with those 4 different objectives. I'll walk through this table to familiarize yourself with it again. We have going down the rows here, the performance metrics associated with the different objectives. And this is in priority order. So starting at the top, maintaining the stock above 20%. So this is the probability the stock is less than 20%. So we want that number to be small. This is the probability that the relative spawning biomass is less than 36%. So we want that number to be less than 50% or 0.5. The third one is the median TCY. So that's just the TCY you would expect on average in the simulations in the short term, the next 4 to 14 years. And then the AAV is a measure of variability. And that's sort of the average amount of change from year to year you would expect the TCY to occur over a 10-year period. This top table is for an annual stock assessment, and the bottom table is for a triennial stock assessment frequency with the exact same performance metrics going down. So to summarize briefly what these 2 tables are saying, one is there's no conservation risk, and you can see that probability of being less than 20% is a very, very small number. So the stock really isn't getting to low levels at all. The probability that the spawning biomass is less than 36% passes for all of these SPR levels examined here. And you can see that because at the highest fishing intensity, you're still 45% of the time you're well, actually 55% of the time you'd be above the RSB of 36%. So it passes for all of those SPR levels. The TCY is reduced about 4 million pounds for every SPR increase of 3%. So you can think about this, for every 1% increase in the SPR, the TCY is reduced about 1.3 million pounds. And that's the fishing intensity level. The median TCY is increased in the triennial stock assessment frequency. So if we look at a 43% SPR, you see 60 million pounds on average in an annual assessment frequency, and about a 61 million pound average in a triennial assessment frequency. And furthermore, you get about 24% variation on average in the TCY, and that's reduced to 20%. And so basically you're reducing the interannual variability in the TCY in a triennial stock assessment frequency. Now, the last row in the smaller font is the new sort of performance metric that we're just presenting for informational purposes. And it's basically showing there's a greater than 1 in 3 chance that the spawning biomass will be less than the spawning biomass in 2023 when fishing at SPR 46%. So you see here, it's about a 1/3 and a 1/3. So similar for both annual and triennial. And so that's something to consider. We were at a low point in 2023. A lot of people didn't like being there, but there's somewhat of a high chance that we could be back at that point, even at a lower fishing intensity. So that's a quick description of a lot of results and a lot of outcomes for this year in the MSE. We also investigated constraints on the interannual change in the TCY, thinking, well, if we want low interannual variability, why don't we just constrain it and see what happens? And to give you the brief overview of this, basically what happened is the TCY declined. The TCY is quite a bit less when you put a constraint on it. And we're really trying to still investigate exactly why that's occurring, but we believe it's occurring because with the constraint, you actually go to low levels because you have higher TCYs in some years. And when we're at low levels, the percent change has a slower time climbing out of those low levels to the high levels because it's a maximum percentage change. It does reduce the interannual variability, though, as can be seen here, by quite a bit, as you would expect. And the probabilities of falling below the spawning biomass in 2023 are about the same. So a brief summary of the management procedure evaluations are there's no conservation concern across the options investigated here. An SPR near 40% would put you on the target of a be 36%. So it'd fluctuate right around a relative spawning biomass of 36%. Increase in SPR of 1% resulted in approximate 1.3 decrease in the TCY. The interannual variability in the TCY increased at a faster rate for fishing intensities at 43% and greater. So actually, fishing at 46% and then moving to an intensity of SPR 43% increased the interannual variability by quite a bit, where it didn't increase as much for fishing intensities at SPR 46%, 49%, and 52%. Triennial assessment frequency increased the TCY and reduced interannual variability. So that's sort of a win-win right there. And the SRB noted this in their report from their last meeting. And then a 15% constraint reduced the TCY, but also reduced interannual variability. The MSAB felt that the constraint was just reducing the TCY by quite a bit and didn't outweigh the benefits of reducing the interannual variability. So if anyone's interested in seeing more of these results, you can always look at the MSE Explorer on the link there, and it has all the results of the different management procedures that we investigated. So the MSAB had a recommendation. You've seen this also, and I've broken down this recommendation of a management procedure into multiple bullets, including the justification for that. As a reminder, this recommendation was to update the reference management procedure for one 3-year cycle on a trial basis using the triennial stock assessment frequency synchronized with the full stock assessment in 2025. So to give you an example of how that would occur, we put this graphic together at the bottom showing that the decisions made in 2026 at the 102nd annual meeting would be based on the 2025 stock assessment. So those decisions would be based on a full stock assessment. Then 2027, 2028 TCUIs would be based on the FIS 032 WPOE. And then in 2029 would be decisions based on the full stock assessment conducted in 2028. So the second part of the MSAB recommendation up top here is to change the reference SPR to 46% in those assessment years and non-assessment years based on the proportional change in the FIS 032 WPOE. The justifications for this, as we saw, the triennial stock assessment frequency increased the TCY, reduced interannual variability. A lower fishing intensity would actually reduce the probability that spawning biomass is less than the 2023 spawning biomass in the short and the long term. The long-term results are not shown here. And it would result in lower interannual variability, and that's the lower interannual variability compared to an SPR 43%. So that's the evaluation of management procedures succinctly in just a few slides. That was a lot of work this year and a lot of great work by the MSAB. We also investigated FIS designs. And just to show you briefly, we've investigated a number of FIS designs with the MSE in past years. Previous simulations always used what we call this base design, and that's the idealistic sampling approach, really random selection in all areas from year to year, which is not simulated here because that's not realistic going forward in time. Instead, we're simulating a base block design, which is sampling all IPHC regulatory areas with rotations through charter regions, such that all charter regions are sampled every 1 to 5 years. The core design is sampling just the core stock 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B. Other areas are not surveyed. And then a reduced core is even a smaller subset of the core. And we used a lot of outputs of the space-time model and the assessment simulations to determine reasonable inputs into the MSE simulations. So to summarize here, the FIS design results, there's no conservation concern with reducing the FIS design. However, there was a slight reduction in the probability that the relative spawning biomass was less than 36%, and that was because the TCY was reduced with smaller designs. The more you go into the core, the more reduction in the TCY there was. And the interannual variability actually increased with the smaller designs. So here, reducing the FIS design, as you would expect, reduces the TCY and increases the interannual variability. I think both of those were undesirable qualities, but there's other things to trade off with as well. So to summarize, the FIS designs had this lower TCY and higher interannual variability. And to note, with an SPR 43%, this discussions with the SRB we had, the median TCY declined about 450,000 pounds, moving from the base block to the core design, and about another 450,000 pounds moving to the reduced core design. So at $6 a pound for each 450,000 pound reduction, that equates to about 2.7 million US dollars. And the SRB thought it would be useful to do those calculations. Similar declines were seen with an SPR 52% as well. So it was pretty consistent across the SPR values that we investigated. And we just want to note that there's a non-economic value to the FIS as well. One, it's used when making decisions. It's a factor in the socioeconomic considerations, what's happening in the different areas. We compare it to the fishery-dependent trends, which Dr. Stewart has done today. But it generally gives us a better understanding of the population in general across all areas. So it's a very useful tool for more than just an input into the stock assessment. And it can be used for many other things. Okay, so that's all the simulation results of the MSE. And I just want to give a brief overview of the draft harvest strategy policy, which is available on the interim meeting website. I believe it's document 17, if I remember correctly. This draft harvest strategy policy basically has 4 chapters. An introduction, just giving a brief overview of what a harvest strategy policy is. A chapter describing the objectives and the key principles of the draft harvest strategy policy. These objectives we've already walked through today. Development of the harvest strategy policy. What was the process in making sure that this was developed is robust to uncertainty and is useful for the management of Pacific halibut. And that basically is describing in one part of it, the MSE process. And then applying the harvest strategy policy. What is a management procedure? What's the reference management procedure? what's the SPR value, the reference SPR value, and then how does the decision-making process work at the IPHC. I want to note that this is still a draft. Some sections still may be updated. We have been updating this throughout the year, though. But noting that one section that could be updated is modifying the goals and objectives. And the example here is the recommendation of the MSAB, to maximize yield rather than optimize yield. And then any other changes to management procedure elements, such as an SPR value, assessment frequency, both of which the MSAB has recommended. So I want to show this slide really quick. This is one of the, this is an illustration of the harvest strategy policy, showing on the left here the coast-wide scale portion of it and the management procedure portion of it. And then here is the decision-making process on the right. And so what you can really see, the output of the management procedure is the reference coast-wide TCY. And one change that we've made to this figure at the request of the MSAB, and I really thank the MSAB for that request, is that we've noted that an outcome of the commission is actually the coast-wide TCY and the regulatory area TCYs. And this really highlights that the reference coast-wide TCY is an input into the decision-making process, and that the coast-wide, and that the commission has the option to deviate from that reference coast-wide TCY. So it's really highlighting the flexibility that the commission has in its decision-making process. We also note a lot of management supporting information that goes into the decision-making process as well. So one question, though, is how do you update a harvest strategy policy? Well, this is a draft right now, so we could put some updates into it before the 101st annual meeting. And those decisions made at now or between then would be incorporated into that current draft. Updates may occur, though, as more information is obtained. For example, Commission may make decisions at the 102nd annual meeting, and we would update that into the harvest strategy policy. But it might be useful to define a process for which these updates occur, so that it's not just an ad hoc thing, and that people have an understanding that the harvest strategy policy is a guiding document. But it could be as simple as decisions made at the annual meeting. And then another part of the process, and the draft harvest strategy policy talks about exceptional circumstances. And these are cases where, while the MSC simulation results are not on track, something's not right, we need to fix this, let's go back and take a look. And so an exceptional circumstance might be, and actually this is part of the harvest strategy policy, if the coast-wide all sizes FIS, WPUE, or NPUE from the space-time model is outside of the credible interval predicted or projected by the MSC simulations, then that we call that an exceptional circumstance. And then we'd open up a process for how we would reevaluate the harvest strategy policy and the management procedure in particular. So we'd go through the SRB, the MSAB, do MSC simulations, and then come up with another presentation like this. One that was recommended by the SRB was to include a second exceptional circumstance, and that's if the realized coast-wide total fishing mortality falls outside of the simulated coast-wide total mortality for 2 or more consecutive years. And that would basically be an indication. It's like, wow, the simulations are really not what's actually happening in reality. And so again, it's just a different way to look at that. And the MSAB and the SRB both provided that recommendation, yet to be included in the harvest strategy policy. So that sums it up. A lot of work done this year. And, that's a bit of a long presentation because there was a lot of work to present. I think it's important to present. So a few considerations for the commission, noting this paper, recommending any changes to the objective B, which is to maintain the spawning biomass above B36% or some level. Recommend redefining optimized yield objective to maximize yield and have equal priority with variability in yield. updating the current interim management procedure with a new SPR value and possibly a longer period between stock assessments. Noting the results for FIST designs, recommending any future analyses to support the development of the harvest strategy policy and any edits and modifications to the current harvest strategy policy. And then if there's any requests that you'd like to see for the 101st annual meeting, anything that would help you in moving the harvest strategy policy forward for endorsement, we'd be happy to take at this time. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, thanks very much. That's a long presentation for you. I'm sure there'll be some questions. I see John, you're here. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Paul. I have many questions. This is, really a meaty presentation. There's a lot here. I thank you for that, Alan, and the MSAB and everybody who's put so much thought into this. My mind goes back to our discussion about this at the work meeting, just between the commission and the secretariat staff. Obviously, not a public meeting, but my recollection is that there we agreed to have some check-ins on the harvest strategy policy between then, early September, and the annual meeting, including a check-in prior to this interim meeting. At least my thought around that was these are really substantive issues, and it seems like if the commission is to get to a point where we are really ready to adopt a harvest strategy policy with these kinds of elements, we're going to need some workshop type sessions, maybe a full day to really get into a lot of these things and have some robust discussion around them. And so I'm struggling a bit here. I do have a lot of questions about particular elements and recognize we don't really have the time to get into that during this interim meeting. It's more of a comment than a question, but I guess it just from my standpoint highlights uncertainty as to our path forward, and feeling like if we are going to get across the finish line of being ready to adopt a harvest strategy policy, that it's going to take quite a bit more iterative discussion back and forth to be able to get there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. See if the secretary hand up. Did you want to
Oh, that's for Bob, Commissioner Alvison, who's in the room. Yeah, Paul, I have a question to Alan. If we adopt in some part this harvest strategy policy, I assume going along with that is adopting this maximize TCEY rather than the optimizing TCEY. Does that put us in a formulaic position, situation where we can't second guess as commissioners and dial back in an area? And I'm specifically thinking of the Bering Sea right now, and Buck's comments. I note that there's only been 18 deliveries out of 4B, 46 out of 4C, D, and E, 4C and D. And I know a number of those boats that made those deliveries had to make multiple deliveries and still didn't catch their assigned IFQs. So we're at 40% delivery in 4C and D and 31%. It's obvious the 032 density is inadequate for the fleet to catch what we think is out there. So I'm into January meeting, and I've adopted this harvest policy and I'm going, oh, damn, I want to be lower than this. What am I, as a commissioner, what am I looking at here?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Albertson. A really good question. And first of all, a number of parts to that. Number one, the objective to maximize the yield or maximize the TCY as an objective has not been adopted by the commission at this time. So what's currently in the draft harvest strategy policy is to optimize yield. The commission can choose to adopt that as a priority objective to maximize the yield, and then we would update the harvest strategy policy. So that's sort of an indication of the process of updating this harvest strategy policy. The question of does adopting the objective to maximize the yield put you into formulaic approach and tie your hands in for lack of a better term? No, it does not. It would actually not change the way the commission operates in its decision-making process at all. It would just be a different objective phrased slightly differently in a way that would allow the MSAB and the commissioners to be able to evaluate the results that I've just shown you. We can then look through the table and find out where's it maximized and how does interannual variability leave. And it would give us a better idea of what the appropriate SPR level is, say. So it's really going to affect the way we analyze the MSE results, will not affect the decision-making process at all. The figure that I showed previously on the slides there is sort of the process, and that flexibility that the commission desires here in the decision-making process remains unchanged. So you would see a reference coast-wide TCY, and then you'd go into your deliberations and understanding what's happening in the different areas, and you'd say, oh wow, the 4CD&E fishery is just really struggling right now, we need to do something, and then you'd make your decisions based on that. But sort of that input into the process is this reference TCY. That would be the starting point, you might say, or the point for which you sort of strive to achieve, but you may not be there at that time. So you'd keep your flexibility.
Follow-up question. What are your thoughts if we adopted some harvest strategy and ran it in tandem with what we're doing now for a couple of years?
I think that is totally reasonable and probably the best way forward, because what the harvest strategy policy is actually describing is how you've been operating the past 8 years. So it actually describes the decision-making process as well. The MSE simulations incorporate that uncertainty or that variability in the decision-making process. So the MSE simulations are operating in the exact same way. It has a reference TCY, and then it may adjust that TCY up or down. It doesn't know exactly what's going through the mind of a commissioner, but it's robust to the commissioners being able to make that decision as well.
Did the MSAB recommend that? I thought I read that.
For
Running it in tandem.
well, what they recommended was considering the harvest strategy policy for adoption at this time, because it is describing how the commission actually operates. So saying that they would operate in tandem is not really the best way to characterize it. I would say adopting the harvest strategy policy would be a way of recognizing how the commission has been operating. And it's not doing two things at once. It's just adopting a guideline document that explains how the commission has operated in the past.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hicks.
Lost your sound, Peter.
If
Hey, Peter,
you,
we can't hear you. Go ahead, Peter.
hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay. Okay. How about now?
Yep.
Okay. I'm probably just have some emails coming in, multiple. Sorry about that. It's about triennial and what we would see as commissioners. So every season we get, or every year when it came to decision making, you wouldn't get a risk table, would you? You wouldn't. You would just get the information from what FIS did, and because anyways, I'm just curious what kind of information we would get to make our decisions.
Yeah, a really good question, Commissioner DeGrief. And what you would get is probably pretty much the first half or 3/4 of the presentation Dr. Stewart gave today. You get everything up to right when Dr. Stewart, well, I guess right up to lunch, right? Right when you started talking about the modeling, because then the modeling would not occur. But Dr. Stewart would probably give an update on the improvements being planned for the assessment in the future when the next full assessment comes along, and what research is being done to improve the assessment process as well. So you would see the FIS results, you would see the plots of the 032, all sizes, NPUE. You'd see all of those results, and then you'd switch over to the harvest decision or harvest projection presentation, which Dr. Stewart will give next. And in there, we would not have a decision table. You're exactly right. We wouldn't see those risks to future stock decline, but you'd have an update of all the data that's been collected, and look at all the data and what that looked like in the year.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. Stewart had talked about this lag of information. Would the idea be to try to get a fulsome year of information and then run for 3 years? So you have all the data points, you have everything you need, and then do it? Or would it be the same sort of idea where we're projecting and then, some new information comes in next year, but that's not really applied because, we're in this triennial position. And then that's just updated, on the 3rd year. Is that kind of how the flow would have happened, say, for instance, this year?
Yeah, if I'm understanding you right, Commissioner DeGrief, I think that is exactly how it would happen. We always have the full FIS results at the interim meeting. So everything presented from the FIS is the full end results of that. And in this approach of an empirical rule to adjust the TCUI, we would not need the fishery catch rate data. So we wouldn't be worried about that lag in the data. However, when the full assessment comes around, we'd be entering 3 years of fishery data into that new assessment model and seeing the results of that, along with 3 years of FIS data to update the assessment understanding of the halibut stock.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how exactly it would work and how it would work with the information we get as commissioners. So thank you very much.
Yeah, if I may follow up real quick, Commissioner DeGrief, I think the MSAB was, had very similar questions to what you had, and that's why they phrased it on a trial basis, because, I can sit here and describe it over and over. I think maybe the MSAB just got sick of me talking or something, but they said, let's just try this on a trial basis because I just got to see how it happens. So, it was more like, let's see what the process is like and get a better understanding of it, but not commit to the process, forever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else, Peter? Nope.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, Neil?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Dr. Hicks. I have a couple questions. My first one was, I was just looking through the scenarios that, or sort of the results that began around slide 17. And one of the things that struck me was how high the median TCEY numbers are. And that got me thinking, like, what were the starting conditions for the modeling? Because we're so far away from those numbers now. And then that led me to another question about, did we sort of run these scenarios with starting conditions that reflect where the stock is now? And do you have any thoughts about whether that would change, like, the probabilities and results that are presented in these tables?
Thanks, Commissioner Davis. Yes, a very good question. And wouldn't it be nice to get back to those median TCYs? The MSC simulations are what's called conditions to the current stock assessment. So they are starting at where the current stock assessment believes we're at in 2020, the start of 2025. But what you got to take into consideration there, one, there's a lot of uncertainty in the stock assessment as well. So we're starting at various points in 2025 for these simulations and then projecting into the future. When we project into the future, and these are short-term median TCY, so this is an average over projections 4 to 14 years into the future. All that we know, our best understanding of the Pacific halibut stock is that we're at some of the lowest weighted age and some of the lowest recruitment levels we've seen in a long time. And so these projections are, we really can't go outside the bounds of what we've seen, even though the weighted age can go less and we can still have periods of low recruitment. The projections on average are going to show increasing weighted age and average recruitment. So it's going to paint a rosier picture than where we're currently at. But I do note the MSC is not just all optimism. It's showing that in that time frame, the probability that the spawning biomass is less than where it's estimated in 2023 is still a 36% chance that it would be less than that in the 4 to 14 year period in the future. So it's saying the stock can decline. But the thing is, there's a lot of variability in these results. This is just a median TCY. So there's going to be half of the TCYs are less than that. And in some cases, they're probably around 20 to 30 million pounds. But in other cases, they're probably around 60 to 70 million pounds. And a lot of that is, well, some of that's out of the control of management, being the environmental effects on the stock, being weighted age of recruitment. But some of it is dependent on management, as we see in the table. So what we're really looking at here is the effect in the table. A second quick comment is a lot of people say when they interpret MSE results is to not focus so much on the exact values here, but to show the comparison across the management procedures. And so when I say, you know, the TCY is reduced about 4 million pounds with an SPR increase of 3%, that's really showing you the effect of a decision on what SPR should be. And so it's indicating how the management's affecting the stock.
Yeah, that last part I think is particularly helpful. Thank you. Another question I had was related to slide 20, and then it connects into some of the recommendations on 27. But so I just wanted to make sure I followed right here. In the second bullet, essentially it's a recommendation to change our FSPR from 43 to 46. And then I guess I assume that, you know, this means we'd apply it in the assessment year, and then it would essentially sort of be played forward in the non-assessment years through this proportional change. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, let me recharacterize it and make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. But you're exactly right, is that this recommendation to move to an SPR 46% would be a change from the current 43%. And that's based on an analysis of the interannual variability, basically, and the interannual variability being at a low point around SPR 46%. And how that would have, say the commission was to adopt that at the annual meeting and use that SPR value, then yes, that would be the reference. Well, this is sort of the lag in information. If the commission was to adopt an SPR 46% at annual meeting at the 101st annual meeting coming up, then yes, that would be used at the 102nd annual meeting in 2026, presented as the reference TCY from the stock assessment. SPR is not used in the non-assessment years. It's just purely based on the FIS. And if the commission was to adopt a triennial assessment frequency, they could also adopt that the reference TCY changes in proportion to the FIS 032. And then for decision making in 2029, we would come back and the stock assessment would use an SPR 46%. Does that help with the understanding of the process?
It does. Thank you. I guess maybe it's for a sort of a follow-up where we can explore further, just understanding what those intervening years really. I guess I'm assuming that if we were to make proportional adjustments in response to the FIS results in the intervening years, maybe I'll ask a question, would we be able to estimate what that would equate to as FSPR or not without a stock assessment?
Yeah, we would really need a stock assessment to do that, just to have the data incorporated properly and then do the calculations appropriately.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies. And then if I could, I just have one more question, which is related to the recommendation about the objective on slide 27. And again, it's just sort of for my own clarification and understanding. So, you know, throughout the presentation here, there were sort of a variety of things that were alluded to regarding the objective. There was discussion with the MSAB about like a threshold TCEY, but I think that has kind of evolved into this recommendation, which is more about an absolute spawning biomass. And so I kind of have two questions here. I think right now our objectives related to this are actually about relative spawning biomass. So I was curious about, you know, that distinction. And then I noticed that the recommendation said it could be essentially in addition to or in place of. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about what it would mean to do it in addition to as opposed to in place of the current objective.
Sure, thanks, Commissioner Davis. First of all, the objective B in your priority list, the Commission's priority list, is currently, as you noted, stated in terms of relative spawning biomass and maintaining the relative spawning biomass above 36%. As noted on one of the earlier slides, the relative spawning biomass of the stock status is really measuring the effect of fishing, and that current stock status is above 36%, even in the most recent stock assessment that Dr. Stewart presented earlier. So we have really good status, but I don't think everybody's happy with the low catch rates in the stock. The catch rates are more associated with the absolute spawning biomass, what is actually the weight of fish in the water, not the relative weight that would have been out there. So that's the slight distinction between the relative spawning biomass in objective B and a potential new objective related to absolute spawning biomass, is it would be more consistent with the catch rates that are observed on the water. And the second part of your question related to the, you know, in addition to, potentially in addition to, is providing either replacing that relative spawning biomass objective with an objective related to absolute spawning biomass, or as the MSAB also brainstormed on a coast-wide TCEY level. You could replace it, or you could add a fifth objective in that priority list, and the fifth objective could be related to absolute spawning biomass and would be similar to that extra row that was presented where we had the probability of falling below the spawning biomass in 2023. So an additional objective could be maintain the absolute spawning biomass above the level estimated in 2023, and then that would result in another performance metric being put into the MSE results.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I am curious, and it doesn't have to be today, to understand what it would mean in terms of like our ability to meet all of these objectives, given sort of like it's like another hurdle, if you like, to get over, and what the kind of cumulative or interacting consequences would be if we said we want it in addition to. So now we have to meet a relative supply and biomass objective and an absolute. But I realize that may be hard to answer in the moment and have something to follow up on. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I have a question, and then I'd like to come back to John's comment about how to move ahead. So, Alan, on slide 4, you have the harvest strategy policy along with the protocol amending the convention to provide the basis to manage risk to Pacific halibut fisheries and Pacific halibut population. I missed the point of what you were getting at there, maybe, but when I go back and look at the actual protocol itself, it speaks to optimizing. And so is there a conflict between the amending protocol and what you're proposing?
Thanks, Commissioner Rael. Can you just repeat the last little part and what you thought the conflict was? It seemed to cut out momentarily there.
Yeah, for sure. So if you go to the protocol, it says for the purpose of developing the stocks of halibut of the Northern Pacific Ocean and Bering Sea to the level that will permit the optimum yield from the fishery and of maintaining the stocks at those levels. So is there a conflict between the protocol and what you're proposing? Because you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Rael. I don't see a conflict at all in that. I think optimized yield is still the sort of what we would call a general objective. And then the more measurable objective would be to maximize the yield subject to minimizing the interannual variability. And some discussions that we had this year were actually, and the MSAB was very insightful on this, is that to optimize the yield is not only to maximize the yield, but optimizing yield is maximizing the yield and minimizing the interannual variability. And there might be some other concepts in there too that would optimize yield, such as economics even. But I think it would not be in conflict and would actually fit quite nicely. And in fact, the protocol has that as its overall general objective. The harvest strategy policy would just be a more specifics on the protocol. And that's how I see these two working together.
Okay. Coming back to your comment, John, about the way ahead, it seems to me, like you said, that I think we need to see a bit more of a roadmap from the Secretariat, how this would unfold. And given the amount of time we have between the annual meeting and now, it seems that may be a challenge to arrive at a decision at the annual meeting, but nonetheless, maybe if it's mapped out of how this would be implemented, it still could be presented at the annual meeting, and maybe that leads to some more questions and some more, I guess, fine tuning of the way ahead, which still could be provided for a decision in next year. But I agree with you, John. I think we need to see a bit more about how this could be implemented. And I think as well that we need to make sure that it's has an adequate time for consultation with our expected delegations and people that are interested in this fishery before I think we could make a decision at the annual meeting. I think we need a little more information first.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Paul. And actually, just the immediately preceding discussion there about the MSAB's recommendation for maximizing TCUI versus optimizing, and this idea that linking it to variability solves everything. I'm at a loss for that, and that just illustrates how I think these things need more discussion. It seems like we could maximize coastwide TCUI by harvesting 60, 70 million pounds a year and not have any variability and fish it into a horrible state, but we would be meeting our goals, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And that's where I was coming before in saying I felt like we needed some kind of a link to sustainability, like maximize TCUI while adhering to principles of sustainability or something along those lines. Anyway, Paul, I appreciate your suggestion about asking the Secretariat to kind of map things out a bit more. I thought that's the direction we were going when I raised this at the work meeting. and really feel like we need a bit more of an iterative approach with some back and forth and robust opportunity for discussion on these issues if we're going to get to a point of agreement.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's see if Alan or Dave want to respond.
Yeah, thanks. If I could, thanks, Chair. I think that's very, very valid points, and it's something that clearly we're trying to work towards bringing the Commission to a point where you're comfortable with making that a decision to adopt the harvest strategy policy. Chair, I think your comment of potentially working on it between now and the AM paper deadline, which is I think the 28th of December, and then still presenting it at the IM100, which will also allow not only Commission discussions, but additional stakeholder input at that meeting, might then lead to, as you said, potential special session or an intersessional process of additional consultation amongst the commissioners, your advisors, and the Secretariat to get us to that point in a comfortable way. And so I think that would be a potential way forward, listening to the commissioners and some of that hesitation that you're expressing, that we still move forward with it. We try and develop a little bit more in terms of that roadmap to get you to a comfortable place, with potentially adopting the harvest strategy policy at some point next year. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Let's see if there's any other commissioner comments or questions. Neil?
Well, I mean, I do want to pick up on John's point about the sustainability and the maximized TCUI. Like, I think my understanding is we have that like conclusively covered because the objectives are hierarchical. So our first objective is all about conservation, and it is only within those bounds, once our conservation objective is met, that the subsequent objectives can be, that we can sort of pursue them. So I do think, John, to your point, like we need to make sure that that is, you know, very explicit and very clear to everyone. So maybe there's a bit of like a communication piece there, or how this is kind of put together in a policy and so on. That's going to be important, because I mean, I think we all share that view. Like we are not going to be making choices that are fundamentally unsustainable.
Thanks, Neil. That's very helpful. Any other commissioners want to provide any further guidance on this, or is what we have arrived at so far good enough for proceeding now to the annual meeting? Not seeing here any disagreement, Dave, so I think that's acceptable, what you were proposing.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. With that agenda item wrapped up then, Chair, maybe take a 15-minute break and come back and hear from Dr. Stewart.
Yeah, that would be good. And then I think we have another opportunity for public comment and questions.
That's correct. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I think everyone's here, Dave. We can hear you. So we're going to hear from Ian first, I think, on harvest decision tables for 2025.
That's correct, Chair. And so, Secretariat, this is paper 13, Rev 1. If we could have the PowerPoint up, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much. And over to you.
Okay, so this is the follow-up to the stock assessment presentation, where I present the projections for the next 1 to 3 years, as well as the harvest decision table. There's no change to the approach we've used for projections this year. As in the past, we project a constant TCUI for the next 3 years over a range of different mortality levels, ranging all the way from no fishing up to an F35% that we would consider to be the maximum amount of sustainable yield or the maximum harvest rate that can be applied to this stock over the long term. And that will encompass a pretty broad range of different mortality levels, with checkpoints around the status quo, the 3-year surplus, and the current F43 reference level. For each of those different yields, we then calculate the probability of various different risk metrics: stock decline, dropping below our reference points, fishery decline, and the probability of exceeding the reference level. This didn't work. Well, it looked much better than this previously. I'm not sure what happened when we put it into Adobe, but for this slide, this is supposed to demonstrate how we read the decision table. And rather than seeing any of the numbers here, what you're really just supposed to focus on is the colors. So from across the top, you have the various yields from low to high, from left to right. On the left are the risk metrics, the various risk metrics that I discussed. And then across the center of the table are the estimated risks. And the intent of this slide was just to illustrate that and not actually to look at any of the specific numbers. Yeah, it's supposed to look more like that. So what I'm going to do then is, rather than go through and read a bunch of the probabilities to you, I'm going to move from left to right across this table, one column at a time. I'm going to start with the column that's highlighted here, which is no fishing mortality, and then move to the right. And for each of those, I'll graphically show you what the projection looks like over the next 3 years. And then I'll highlight some of the important risk metrics that are associated with that particular column or that particular yield alternative. So the first of those is the no fishing mortality. So of course the TCEY is 0, the SPR is 100%. And you can see in this case that the stock would be projected to be increasing over the next 3 years. And this alternative is intended to illustrate the maximum productivity of the stock. So given the year classes that are in the water right now and the biology of this species, this is the fastest it could possibly increase. You see there's a very low chance of stock decline. And at best, at the end of 3 years, we might be back to somewhere close to where we were in 2016. So this really puts the sideboard on where we could possibly get to in 3 years. We then go up to the first checkpoint here, which is the status quo minus 10%. This would be a TCEY of 31.76 million pounds. And we would estimate that that would correspond to an SPR of 50%. You can see that already we've flattened the trajectory of the stock substantially, maybe a slight increase. The probability of stock decline over the next 1 and 3 years is approximately 1 in 3. And there's approximately a 32% chance of exceeding the F43 reference level, even if with a target or a expectation of an SPR of 50%. If we then go up a little bit more to the status quo, which would be the same coast-wide TCEY as in 2024, a TCEY of 35.28 million pounds, we estimate that this would correspond to an SPR of 46%, so very close to the previous reference prior to F43. You can see again that we've flattened the trajectory slightly more. Now the probability of stock decline has gone up to 41 or 44% in 1 and 3 year time horizon. We now have 40% chance that that might exceed the F43 reference level. If we go up yet again to 37.35 million pounds, this is what we would call the 3 year surplus. And so by definition, this particular alternative has a 50% chance of stock decline at the end of 3 years. This run is essentially flip a coin and maybe we're above, maybe we're below where we are now at the end of the 3 year projection with a constant TCEY of 37.35 million pounds. You'll note that the probability of exceeding our F43 reference point is 44%. So we're approaching that break-even point at an SPR of 45%. The next alternative is that reference level of SPR equals 43%. That would correspond to an estimated 39.83 million pounds, or slightly larger than the status quo and the 3 year surplus. Now, by definition, that has a 50% chance of exceeding the reference level of 43%, because that is the point estimate. You can see that the trajectory has flattened even further. And in fact, there's actually a 56% chance of stock decline in a 1 year time horizon and a 57% chance over the 3 year time horizon. So essentially, this is now more likely than not, the stock would be going down over that 3 year time horizon. If we then go all the way up to what we would consider an MSY proxy, this would be an SPR of 35%. In some fisheries management realms, this might be your overfishing limit, or something where you wouldn't expect to be able to fish any harder than this under any circumstances. This is obviously a much higher TCEY at 53.22 million pounds. And you can see here quite clearly that the stock trajectory is now trending downwards. We have high certainty that the stock would be declining over the next 3 years, 87 or 86% chance of decline over a 3-year time horizon. So it's pretty clear as we look across these alternatives from no fishing at all up to this MSY proxy that we've gone from a fairly steeply increasing stock to a decreasing stock. And this is really this is the effect of these different management alternatives over the next 3 years. So despite the broad range of uncertainty, you can see that the stock does respond to the management action that's selected over the next 3 years. Now here's the full decision table without the color coding, just to show you all these various probabilities. And I'm not going to go through these numbers, but it's there for your review. To summarize the stock assessment projections, as I mentioned, for the stock assessment, we are in a continuous case of poor recruitment up at least through 2016. And those year classes through 2016 are already enough to essentially dictate the projection over the next several years. Even if we saw another year class coming in 2017 or 2018 or subsequently, we are still in a situation of limited short-term yields, even if those potential strong year classes were to emerge in the near future. And there's certainly no guarantee that that's going to happen. Importantly, these projections already account for the still uncertain 2016 year class. Again, it's not estimated to be huge, maybe similar in magnitude to the 2012 year class, although still uncertain. But over the next 3 years, those fish will continue to mature and they will comprise a larger and larger portion of the spawning biomass as projected forward. Now, there are several risks that are not explicitly included in the decision table. The first, looking back at our discussion about the commercial fisheries CPUE, if there is an additional decline in the CPUE, that could have an increase, that could actually increase the risk or chance of stock decline. And we looked at that with an alternative run here. So we used the value for 2024 for the commercial fisheries CPUE, and we added an additional 5% decline. Again, we're not sure this is going to happen, but we wanted to see what would it look like if we had perhaps complete logbooks right now that reflected the same trend we've seen over the last couple of years. From that, we would estimate that we would move at the status quo TCEY, we would move from an F46 down to an F45. So perhaps a 1% change in the SPR as a function of that updated CPUE if we see a similar pattern next year and all the other data remain consistent. We recognize that the stock remains at historically low spawning biomass and low productivity, and that has corresponded to low catch rates both in the fishery independent setline survey and the directed commercial fishery, with logistical and economic effects on both of those components. And then finally, the ecosystem uncertainty remains high. And I highlight this here because in the past, we may have been in a situation where we would think, well, on average, this is what recruitment does. And so it's unlikely that we're going to continue to see, for example, low recruitments moving forward in the future. I would say that given the assessment or the ecosystem uncertainty, it's unclear whether or when we should expect the current ecosystem considerations or the current ecosystem conditions to turn around. And so rather than thinking of, well, the longer we go in this run of low recruitments, the more unlikely it gets, it's really hard to say at this point. And I would say that perhaps at this stage, history is not a clear indicator of what we might see moving forward, because we've also already seen a long run of low recruitments where we wouldn't necessarily have expected them, even through a PDO regime shift. So in addition, for background material for decision making, this table reflects the recent adopted TCEYs going back to 2013. There's a lot here, but you can track how the TCEYs have evolved in each of the regulatory areas as well as coast-wide. So again, these are the adopted TCEYs that were set by the Commission in each of these years, or for each of these years. The next slide adds to that with the reference TCEY that was estimated for each of these years, noting that for 2025, we have the reference TCEY, but obviously the TCEYs have not yet been adopted. I'll highlight here that the reference itself has evolved over time. So up until 2015, we were using what we called the blue line, which didn't correspond necessarily to a specific SPR, generally it was a slightly lower overall harvest rate than we moved to in 2016, which was an SPR of 46%. That SPR reference level was held in place until 2020, and then the commission moved to an F43 reference level after that. So you can see that generally the TCEYs have increased over this time period with some lower and higher values in individual assessment years, just reflecting the assessment variability. All things considered, if the stock hadn't changed over this time period, we would expect a consistent increase across this time period from the blue line to F46 to F43. You'll note that during this time period since 2020, when we've had an F43 reference, that reference has gone up and down several times, from a low of 39 million pounds up to a high of almost 52 million pounds. And for 2025, we estimate that back down at the lower end of that range, in large part because of the decline in spawning biomass that we've estimated over the last several years. So the recommendations for this presentation are to note this paper, and should the commission want to see any additional harvest decision table alternatives presented at the AM, we can easily add those for that meeting. In addition, we can create, after the beginning of January, when we get the updated estimates of non-directed discard mortality, we will be able to produce detailed mortality projections, breaking the projected mortality down to individual IPHC regulatory areas and fishery sectors based on the catch sharing plans and agreements that are in place. Those can be produced at any time leading up to or during the annual meeting. And that concludes this presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. Any questions for Ian from commissioners? Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Do you mind going back to slide 11? Yeah, so the one thing that really struck me in looking at this was stock status and spawning biomass, and particularly the chance that we are at less than 20%. I believe in the last number of years, stock assessments, we've seen this at a near zero level. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that this year. We're seeing it something, of the ilk of 10 to 14% here, which is surprising. It seems like a really big change. I guess that's just due to the 17% decline in spawning biomass. But to me, it's somewhat alarming. So I don't know if there's a question there, but maybe you could fill us in a little bit more on that.
I can, and thanks for highlighting this. That I didn't make this highlight during the projections. You're absolutely right. These are larger risk values than we've seen in recent stock assessments, and it is due to the fact that this current stock assessment comes in at a lower spawning biomass and estimating a slightly higher effective fishing on the stock. And so you can see also across those rows, for example, the probability that the stock is less than 20% in a 1-year time horizon. At status quo minus 10%, that is a 10% probability, or a 10 out of 100. And as we go across the table, that goes up to 12, then 14, all the way to 19% on the far side. And so what that indicates is that we're down now with the range of uncertainty actually overlapping with that lower threshold limit. So we are at a lower stock size, and there is a higher risk that we could be at or could decline below that conservation threshold.
Yeah, and I just bring that up because of the substantial change from last year, and as well, I mean, that has serious implications to our fishery that would be, obviously economically devastating. And so when I see those risk profiles trending upwards, it's, somewhat concerning. So thank you.
Peter, any other questions? Not seeing any, Ian. Thanks for the presentation. So, Dave, I don't have public comments and questions here. Would you be able to address that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. We do have a couple of questions. The PowerPoint's just being uploaded at this moment. We have a couple of questions for Dr. Hicks as well as Dr. Stewart. As that's being brought up momentarily. I can see it's being moved up. It's just taking a little bit longer. Okay, so if we move down, we have a question or an oral comment from Forrest Braden regarding slide 17 for Dr. Hicks. Forrest, we will just give you the microphone, unless Dr. Hicks, you're able to interpret what's already there and you already know the question.
No, I appreciate the microphone.
Go ahead, Forrest, if you can hear us. So you have a microphone there, Forrest. Are you any success in activating it?
While we're figuring that out, I can try to answer based on discussions we had at the MSAB. And at the MSAB, we discussed about at the MSAB, we had a discussion about the commission deviating from the, say, F43% reference TCY, and one of the part of the reasoning behind that was to increase the spawning biomass so to levels that would support higher TCYs in the future. And we had a discussion about what that actually meant if you were to deviate or you were to take these larger TCYs at this point in time. And what, if I remember the conversation correctly, we had a look at the range of TCYs that would be resulting from reducing the fishing intensity. And actually, by reducing the fishing intensity, you go to high levels less often, but you're not necessarily reducing those probabilities of low TCYs. So I think the point is that it might be a little bit more, there might be a little bit more nuance into, are there really benefits of reducing the TCY? Do you really gain higher TCYs in the future? And we didn't go too much more into it than that, but I think one of the requests of the MSAB, if I remember correctly, was to have a closer look at what really are the gains of deviating from the reference TCY when you're at low spawning biomass levels, and we can certainly do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Having some issues getting Forrest microphone to work. We can see from this point, Forrest, that you have access rights to a microphone. What I suggest we do is, while that's being figured out, we move to the next question, and then we can come back to you. So if you can continue to work with the team behind the scenes, we'll get your microphone activated. The next question is a written question from Corey Niles, and this is related to the harvest decision table from Dr. Stewart. It's a lengthy written question, so bear with me. It says, thinking about risk, the simulation on the FIS reduced survey you presented under agenda item 5.2, the one that explored the hypothetical 15% bias, the results suggest that SPR would only be cut off by 1%. That underestimate doesn't seem very concerning in light of the typical uncertainty seen from one assessment to the next. And then I'm just going to leave the rest of the question open and might pass to Dr. Stewart to respond.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Wilson. I think there's a couple points here. I'll try to summarize. The first is the observation that the stock assessment is fundamentally fairly uncertain. We have a broad range of credible intervals for the spawning biomass and for fishing intensity. And not only within a year when we see those broad ranges, but also between years when the assessment moves around within those ranges, we do see a substantial variability in the results. And I think that's a fair point that reflects the status of the information we have about the stock. However, this discussion about a potential bias in the survey, I would say one way to think about this would be in addition to the other uncertainties that we had. It's not necessarily that it's sort of subsumed into the normal variability of the stock assessment. This would be something that would be above and beyond the normal variability that we would see in the stock assessment. So in terms of the last question there, which was sort of helping people think through how to use this information as part of the decision-making process, I would say it's probably best to look through the results as we normally would and consider what level of risk you may or may not find acceptable, and then consider that there might be this additional risk on top of that. So it's not necessarily that they are, one is subsumed into the other. I think this is a new risk that we are just looking at this year because we have yet to, this is the first time we've had this much uncertainty in the Fishery Independent Setline Survey for this number of years in a row, where we had a truncated design in 2020. We had good sampling leading up to that, and so the effect was much smaller. Now we're looking at the cumulative effect of several years of decreased survey. In fact, multiple years, particularly as we go out west, since we've had a real good survey index. So I hope that's answering your question, Corey, and if not, you might have another chance to ask later.
Great. Thank you very much, Ian. Let's try Forrest one last time. Forrest, can you try your microphone again? Doesn't seem like we're having any luck, Chair. So with your permission, we might defer Forrest's question to the end of the day, and we'll try and get a written question if we can't get his microphone to work. And that's all the questions we have. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, okay, that sounds like a good plan then, David. So if there are no other public comments or questions, we'll move on to agenda item 8 and over to Dr. Webster.
Fantastic. And so if we could have presentation for paper 14 brought up on screen, please. And Dr. Webster, over to you.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon. Just turning my camera on. There you go. That did not work. Try again. All right. So my second presentation today is about the FIS designs. It's basically a recap of the process we went through in coming up with the designs this year, and a presentation of the final design Commission has decided on at the recent special session. So some background. At the work meeting we had in September 2024 with the commissioners, the Commission provided the following directive to the IPHC Secretariat regarding the IPHC's Fishery Independence Headline Survey. Noting that the three Fishery Independence Headline Survey block design options described in the accompanying paper and modular add-on options, the Commission directed the Secretariat to provide a new paper for the FIS design. It contained the following: section that depicts the optimal 5-year rotational FIS design and its associated costs and revenue, section that proposes a fiscally viable FIS design option for 2025. I won't read all the text. Potential other sources of funding to complement existing known funding options that we further explored, an explanation of the potential bias that may result from the designs described above. At the 14th special session of the IPHC on October the 31st, the Commission decided on the FIS design for 2025. This presentation reviews information provided to the Commission by the Secretary of Staff in response to the work meeting directive that I just presented, along with the design that resulted from the special session. Just excuse me a moment. Thank you. Okay. A bit of background as usual. The IPHC FIS is our most important source of data on Pacific halibut. Provides data for estimating weight and numbers per unit effort, which we use to estimate stock trends, stock distribution, and are important input in the IPHC stock assessment. Provides biological data for the use in the assessment, and we've had an annual FIS following the current design criteria each year since 1993. The design has been expanded twice in the early years and more recently in 2011 to 2019. This is the full FIS grid of 1,890 stations in orange, ranging from Northern California out to the Western Aleutians and the Bering Sea shelf edge. It's on a 10 by 10 nautical mile grid within the depths of 10 to 400 fathoms. Our station does not go to 10 fathoms in the Bering Sea because of the large size of the shallow waters there, so we augment the data from the FIS grid with data from NIMS, in particular the NIMS, the NOAA Troll Survey in the Bering Sea, which is an annual survey as well. We also, in most years, get data from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Troll Survey in Northern Sound. So we cannot fish the full FIS grid each year. It's logistically challenging and cost prohibitive. So we prioritize sampling effort based on scientific needs. We want precise estimates of the indices of abundance and stock distribution with a low potential for bias. And that requires more frequent sampling in areas with high variability or greater density. And we have a goal of long-term revenue neutrality. Increase effort in revenue positive areas to offset cost of sampling with density habitat, and potentially reduce effort in high-cost areas to avoid large deficits. And this is the process we've gone through in the last couple of years, which has led to scale-back FIS designs. Summarizing our objectives in tabular form: primary objective, scientific objective, sampling for stock assessment, stock distribution. That presents requirements in terms of station distribution, count, and skates per station. Secondary, long-term revenue neutrality, which I just mentioned. We also have tertiary objectives, including minimizing our input on the stock, assisting others, for example, other agencies in collecting data, and any ad hoc decisions as a result of IPHC policies. So turning to the information we provided to the Commission at the work meeting in September, and again at the special session, we devised a base block design presented for 2025 to 2029. It prioritized some annual sampling in each biological region for stock assessment purposes, ensure that all charter regions in the core of the stock, 2B, 2C, 3A, and 3B, are sampled over a 3-year period, resulting in CVs, which are relative measures of precision, for abundance indices of no more than 15%, which is relatively low, and coverage in other areas that prioritize to minimize the potential for bias and to maintain CVs below 25%. The sample blocks would be rotated over time, and this design is projected to maintain precise estimates of indices of Pacific halibut density and abundance across the range of the stock. By rotating the sample blocks, which in the core of the stock take the form of our IPHC FIS charter regions, almost all FIS stations are sampled within a 5-year period, 2 to 3 years within the core, resulting in a low risk of large bias in estimates of trend and stock distribution. The Secretariat believes that this design provides a strong scientific basis for all Commission analyses while minimizing costs to the degree possible. And although this is perhaps quite small on anyone's laptop screen, you can see larger versions in the accompanying document or by enlarging the presentation slides when you're able to. But this shows how this block design would proceed over the next 5 years, were it implemented from 2025 to 2029. So not all stations. Recall that we have 1,890 stations in our FIS grid. The stations that will be fished each year are shown in orange, and in the order of somewhere between 600 and 800 stations in this design would be fished each year. So less than half of the stations will be fished each year, but aggregating 3 to 5 years, the vast majority of stations would be fished over that period, including all stations within the core of the stock over a 3-year period. However, the base block design, even though reducing sampling from the types of designs that we fished up until recently, which had more like 12 or 1,300 stations per year, this is still, with current cost predictions, projected to make a large loss in the order of $2 million. So this design for 2025 is not fiscally possible without a large influx of supplementary funds. So the second design that was discussed at the special session was a fiscally viable design for 2025. And so this scaled back sampling considerably in the core of the stock and relative to the base block design, such that one charter region was to be fished in each of 2B and 2C. And these charter regions were chosen because they were projected to reduce losses relative to having no fish at all. And one charter region in each of 3A and 3B in order to maintain some sampling in region 3. And those two charter regions shown in the map are those that would lose the least amount of money. And 60 stations in each of 2A and 4A, 4B, covered by supplementary funding provided by the United States State Department. So together with the supplementary funding and the reduction in the scope of the FIS, this would result in a much smaller net loss of $574,000. And that would have been covered by any additional supplementary funding and the IPHC reserve fund. So the fiscally viable design would meet the basic data needs in terms of collecting samples from all biological regions. However, this design samples fish charter regions previously sampled in 2024 in IPHC regulatory areas 3A and 3B, in preference over regions sampled less recently. Alternative designs that increase spatial coverage of the FIS over the short term would reduce the potential for bias by sampling charter regions not sampled in 2024. This is similar to how the base block design operates. If we can't sample everything in 1 year, let's try to do it over as short a period of time as possible, 2 to 3 years or 5 years if we include lower density regulatory areas. So overall estimates for region 3 would be improved if different charter regions could be sampled in 2025 than those we sampled in 2024. So we presented also to commissioners a couple of modified design options. So replacing the 2 charter regions in 3A and 3B near the border there of those 2 areas with 2 other charter regions that were not fished in 2024. So this option had 2 high priority charter regions in 3A, that's in the Yakutat and Prince William Sound. One was last sampled in 2022, the other in 2023. And outside of region 3, the design is the same as the fiscally viable design. These regions in 3A were projected to lose more money than those included in the fiscally viable design, and so the projected loss was around $710,000. Again, supplementary funding was included for 2A, 4A, and 4B. The other design instead shifted the 2 regions to be sampled to higher priority regions in 3B. Those were both last sampled in 2023. And the loss is predicted to be similar to the option 2 design just presented, where the sampled regions were instead in 3A. The decision at the special session, the Commission tentatively decided on a 2025 FIS design that included all stations in options 2 and 3. So 1 charter region in each of 2B and 2C, which is common to all options presented, not counting the base block design in this presentation. 60 stations in each of 2A, 4A, 4B, covered by supplementary funding, and 2 charter regions in each of 3A and 3B, each previously sampled in either 22 or last sampled in 2022 or 2023, and selected to reduce the bias risk over the short term. The projected deficit is to be covered by a transfer from the IPHC reserve fund of $1 million. And the Commission subsequently made a final decision via intersessional agreement, documented in those 2 links. And this is the map showing that design. It is a combination of the 2 options just presented, option 2 and option 3, showing 517 stations to be sampled in 2025 with one charter region in each of 2B and 2C, 2 and 3A, 2 and 3B, a combined charter region spanning 4A and 4B, and 60 stations in 2A. Moving on to the other requests for information from the Commission. Potential other sources of funding. Supplementary funding from contracting party governments over the course of financial year 2023 to 2024. Secretariat has received direct payments from both governments to supplement the annual FIS, 125,000 from Canada, 114 from the US. For fiscal year 2025, the US has provided $387,000 for the FIS, which was mentioned previously. Secretariat and both delegations will continue to seek supplementary funds in this form in the short term. Large-scale contracting party contributions. The Secretariat has several calls out for substantial contributions from both governments in excess of $2.5 million. More details in the special session appendices. An ongoing engagement plan has been developed in conjunction with the chairperson and vice chairperson for this purpose. Supplementary funding from contracting party governments. The Secretariat is currently exploring options to incorporate a budget line for the FIS that is incorporated directly into the IPHC annual budgeting process. There's more details here. I won't read everything that's on the page. This is also available in the accompanying report. Industry direct contributions throughout the course of 23 and 24. The Secretariat has received informal indications that some industry groups may be willing to offer direct funding for FIS activities in their areas of interest. Pros and cons of utilizing industry funding direct from the industry source. So we need to work through that. We would need to work through before taking this approach. Potential for bias in the FIS designs. Indices of Pacific caliber density can change by large amounts over short periods, with annual changes of 15% or more regularly observed at the level of biological region and regulatory area. Over a 3-year period, large changes in indices of density are the norm, including at the coastwide level. Lack of sampling or low spatial coverage in an area or region means such changes are fully or largely unobserved, leading to biased estimates of indices, stock trends, and stock distribution. Ian mentioned in an earlier presentation that we don't know if the results we got in 2024 are biased, but based on the changes we've seen in recent years, it's likely that they are to some degree. Designs such as that implemented in 2024 and the proposed fiscally viable design therefore have high potential for bias. Note that 2025 will be the second or third year with reduced coverage for much of the stock. So to quantify that, where does that assessment that the risk of bias is quite large come from? Well, these are the estimated 1-year changes in the mean O32 weight per unit effort index by biological region. And so there's a dashed line there. Let me get my little pointing hand here. Excuse me a second. There it is. Okay, so the dashed line indicates a change of 15% in the index from the previous year. And you can see it's not unusual to get changes, generally in the down direction, of greater than 15%. And certainly between 10 and 15% is quite common. Even at the coastwide level, we've seen a change of 15% in 1 year recently, and changes between 10 and 15% are quite frequent. If we look over a 3-year period, then changes of over 15% over that time span are occur more often than not, at both the coastwide level and at the regional level. If we are not observing these changes at other region for a given region, say we didn't sample region 3 in 2025, then space-time modeling and any analysis based on data from previous years would not project a change, and the estimates would end up being biased. So the fiscally viable design would have resulted in about 60% of habitat covered by the FIS or NOAA trawl sampling in 2025, with the bulk of that coming from NOAA trawl sampling. With this coverage and observed levels of change shown in previous slides, we would have expected coastwide indices of abundance to have bias of up to plus or minus 15% following the 2025 FIS. However, bias could have been much higher in biological region 3 and 4B, which would have had lower levels of sampling than the coast as a whole for 2 or more years following completion of the 2025 fiscally viable FIS design. Now, that was not the design selected ultimately at the special session. So the design that was selected does reduce the potential for bias in biological region 3 relative to the fiscally viable design. This design that was chosen at the special session would sample 4 out of 8 FIS charter regions in 3A and 3 out of 5 charter regions in 3B over the period 2024 to 2025, because we're sampling complementary regions across those 2 years, compared to just 2 out of 8 and 1 out of 5 for the fiscally viable design, because some of those regions were sampled twice over the 2-year period. So it's certainly an improvement over the fiscally viable design, but there's still large gaps in coverage and a risk of bias. Our recommendation is simply that Commission notes the accompanying paper featuring the optimal long-term FIS design, the base block design, 2025 interim design options, potential for external funding sources, and examination of bias potentials that may result from non-optimal designs. And with that, happy to take questions.
Hey, Paul.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Bob. So, Ray, I'm not sure if most of those designs had Prince William Sound in it. But I picked up from the state of Alaska that in 2025, they may not allow hook and line inside Prince William Sound because of a rockfish problem they have there. I don't know if that diminishes the quality of a survey potential in there if we're restricted, but it might be something you follow up on the state of Alaska.
Thanks, Bob. Any other questions or comments? Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Ray, you didn't get into it exactly, but I understand that some of the stations will be 8 skates and some will be 4. Are there any that are 6, or is it just 4 and 8?
Tyler and Ian will remember this better than me, but I believe most of them are going to be 6. Is that correct?
We have all regions are going to be 8 skates except for region 4A, 4B, which will be 4 skates.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, thank you. So you're correct, Peter. Thanks.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at this point. So that being the case, we can move on to public comment and questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chair. I'll just have the Secretariat bring up the public comment PowerPoint again, and we'll try Forrest one more time. No, we haven't. Fighting with the Secretary here. No, we don't have a written comment from Forrest yet. Forrest, have you been able to get your microphone to work? No, he's indicating that he still can't get his microphone to work, and we don't have a written question at this time, so we might just have to try and take that tomorrow, Chair. And there's no other public comments at this point.
All right, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so if Forrest could get something in writing, or maybe when we get the microphone working, we can address this question or comments. Thanks to the Secretary of Staff for all the work of getting the information together for us, and appreciate all the questions from commissioners. And it looks like for tomorrow we have, I guess, about half a day scheduled, starting again at 9. And again, there's 2 opportunities for public comment in the morning. So we'll see everyone tomorrow at 9, unless there's any other closing comments. Not seeing any. Thanks very much to everyone, and we'll talk to you tomorrow at 9.
Thanks all.